Good day. Today is Sunday, 14th September 2025, and in my last couple of programs, I have started each program by discussing briefly the situation in Britain and specifically the problems of the Starmer government and Keir Starmer's problems, and most recently the scandal connected to Peter Mandelson. Well, today I'm also going to start briefly by touching on situations in Britain, though I'm not going to be discussing the situation with Keir Starmer or his government, at least not in any detail. I will instead talk briefly about a very big protest that took place yesterday in London. Now, this is a protest called by Tommy Robinson, an individual well known to many people, not just in Britain, but also outside it. It was referred to as the Uniting the Kingdoms rally. It has been described by hostile commentators as being far right. Certainly, I would say that the vast majority of the people, in fact, I'm guessing pretty much everybody who was involved in that protest, certainly does want to see strong restrictions on immigration. But for me, the most important fact about the protest was its sheer size. Now, this suggests, and certainly suggests to many people in Britain, including within the political class, that the discontents that have been growing in Britain and which were growing over the summer, visibly over the summer, are continuing to grow stronger. Now, I have looked at the footage of the protest. Once upon a time, when my eyesight was better, I was reasonably good at guessing the size of a protest. Today, problems with my eyesight make that much more difficult. The official number that the police are giving for the protest is 110,000, which is already a very big protest by British standards. The BBC claims that it was 150,000. Based on what I saw, I think it was significantly bigger than that. And when it comes to the police, one would expect them anyway, usually, to give a lower number for the size of a protest than the actual number of people who were really there. Certainly, the authorities in London, including the police, were taken by surprise by the size of the protest. That clearly caused uncertainty, and the police took steps, I suspect controversial steps with some people, to try to keep the protest away from the centre of government. That previously been permission given for the protesters to protest closer to Whitehall, to the area where the British government is located, to the squares, the square outside Parliament Square, outside the British Parliament building perhaps. I'm not exactly sure. But anyway, they attempted to contain the protest and to move it further away from the centre of power. Now, there's been various explanations given for this by the authorities. I'm not going to discuss what those were. All I will say is that that clearly had an effect on the character of the protest, and it will have probably compressed the crowd to some extent, and that will have made some people angry. And there were also counter-protests, and a certain amount of trouble inevitably resulted. It's important to stress, because there has been attempts to claim otherwise, that the trouble was limited. The protest overall passed peacefully. Now, the other thing I would say is that the media in Britain has clearly tried to downplay the size of the protests, though pretty much everybody agrees and acknowledges, even in the media, that it was very much bigger than had been anticipated, at least by the authorities and by the police as well. So we see large numbers of people coming to London, clearly in a mood to protest the policies of the current government and of the political class. And we can see that the political class and the current government are uneasy, to put it mildly, about the scale of the protests. Now, I'm going to make an observation here of my own. The people who were protesting in London yesterday, 30, 40, 50 years ago, came from a demographic that overwhelmingly supported what is currently Britain's governing Labour Party. They clearly do not feel that the Labour Party represents them in any way any longer. An opinion poll that I saw today shows that people, young people from this demographic, are switching overwhelmingly towards reform. At least the male young men from this demographic are switching overwhelmingly towards reform. Nigel Farage's party, which is, by the way, completely distinct from the organisers of the rally which took place yesterday. We are, in other words, at a time of major social and political change in Britain, and clearly what is fueling it is increasing anger and disaffection with the political class and with the government, the British government itself. Now, there has been a narrative, which I've seen around the world, not just in Britain, that the government is losing control of the situation in Britain. I'm going to push back on that. In my opinion, Britain remains overwhelmingly a peaceful and law-abiding country. I don't get the sense that there is any collapse in law and order and public order, certainly not in the way that some people are saying. What it is true to say, however, is that as these political and social changes take place, the government, the authorities, are showing their nervousness by engaging in clampdowns and restrictions on protests and arrests, which, in my opinion, not only do not reduce the sense of disaffection and discontent that is widespread across Britain, but which, on the contrary, are simply increasing levels of anger and tension in society, which would not otherwise be there. As for the government losing control, I am not sure that it is proper to speak of a government in the old sense in Britain at all. There is a Prime Minister, there is a cabinet, they occupy all the offices of state, they continue to run the administrative machine, but as far as I can tell, apart from their fixation with the conflict in Ukraine, they see their work essentially as keeping things going pretty much as they were and as they are, even as those things slowly, or perhaps not so slowly, continue to get worse. In other words, we do not have government in Britain, we have administration. And this, to a greater or lesser extent, is true in most European countries today. Certainly, I don't see any real sign of any strategy from the government, any political strategy to re-engage with the wider population, or any real strategy from the government to deal with the pressing social and economic problems which are intensifying and which are at the root of much of the disaffection that we see now. And if this is true of the current government, it was also true of the previous Conservative government. The government and the opposition, the official opposition, that is to say, both seem to be marooned in a state of inaction where they have no real answers to the problems that British society is facing today, and from which British society is calling for responses or answers to. And that, as far as I'm concerned, is a very, very troubling and bad thing. And, well, it can only get worse. We are in Britain in a slow motion social and political crisis. And the events of yesterday are a manifestation of it, just as the decay in the government with a Prime Minister who is Prime Minister in nothing but name, and a cabinet whose character I have discussed previously in earlier programs. Well, their inability is a manifestation of that crisis also. Now, I spoke of the various restrictions that there are in Britain. Obviously, that means that I have to choose my words very carefully. But I think, nonetheless, I have made my views on the general state of decay, the deterioration of what is happening in Britain clear. And unless there is a strong and clear sense of direction and a serious attempt to re-engage with the British people, the wider British people, to address their concerns, well, as far as I can see, this decay, this deterioration, this slow motion crisis will continue to get worse until the point comes when it will no longer get worse slowly, as it is doing at the moment. It will get worse much, much more quickly, with consequences which I don't want to try to foresee. Anyway, that's what I'm going to say about this protest that took place yesterday. An important development, and one that reflects the general mood in the country, a mood which I also noted when I travelled around the country with my family a short time ago over the course of our summer holiday, and which is, of course, clearly reflected now in the opinion polls. Anyway, let's now move on to the great geopolitical question, the one that affects in some ways Britain most closely, the geopolitical crisis in Europe. And obviously, I'm talking about the conflict between Russia and the West that has its epicenter in the war in Ukraine. And I will anticipate here by saying that just as the British government has no real answer to the social problems and economic problems that beset Britain, and the increasing alienation of more and more of the British public, something which is also true right across Europe. In France, the credit rating of the country has just been downgraded, and there is the same sense of stasis and paralysis that we see in Britain as well. Anyway, even as this political class, the political leadership of Europe, seem to have no idea what to do about their growing problems, the EU figure, prominent EU figure, Mario Draghi, former technocratic Prime Minister of Italy, former head of the Italian Central Bank, former head of the European Central Bank, has taken recently to complaining himself about the fact that European leaders, the European leadership in its totality, is paying no attention to his own, in my opinion, deeply mistaken prescriptions about how to change the situation and improve Europe's economic situation in general. Of course they haven't. I mean, they're not capable of moving forward even with the kind of plans that Draghi himself outlined. Anyway, just as the European class has no real plan on how to deal with the social and economic problems that beset Europe, except demanding more control, more regulatory and other control at the EU centre, and taking further steps to quash political dissidents in the various member states. They have no real plan, no real ideas about what to do. With the deepening crisis they are confronted with in their relations with Russia and in Ukraine itself, where increasingly they're losing not just control of the situation, but where control, with every single day, to the extent it exists or can exist, is passing further and further towards the Russians. Now, let me first of all begin by returning once again to the dreary subject of the drones that crossed Poland's border and entered Poland from Ukraine. Drones which, at least in their origins, are indisputably Russian. Well, yesterday there was a meeting of the UN Security Council. There was a debate about this drone incursion. The Russians, as they were inevitably going to do, repeated that there was no intention on their side to send drones into Poland. They also made, again, the observation that the drones lack the range to reach the targets in Poland that they reached. As I said, I've already discussed that at length. And they also inevitably repeated their call that the Poles meet with them and discuss this question. And they expressed frustration that nobody in Poland seems to be interested in doing that. This was discussed at some length by Russia's ambassador to the United Nations, Vasily Nebenzia. He discussed over the course of the UN Security Council meeting the fact that the Poles didn't seem to be interested in taking up the Russian offer for talks to discuss what had taken place. But perhaps an even more insightful comments were made by the Russian diplomat Mikhail Ulyanov, who is Russia's permanent representative to international organizations in Vienna. He said that conclusions that Russia was seeking to destabilize the situation in Poland are fundamentally absurd. His exact words were these: what for? He said this all on X. What for? Is it possible to destabilize with 19 unarmed drones? A lot of elementary questions without answers. The Russian Defense Ministry has offered consultations. the Polish Defence Ministry isn't ready. Looks like either a provocation or a misunderstanding, which the Polish side doesn't want to clarify. And I have to say, I agree. I don't know exactly what took place. As I said, there's all kinds of theories. Many of these theories extend to Ukrainian forced flags. I've discussed on various programs how it could have happened by accident. Others suggest that the Russians might have been testing Polish and NATO air defences. On reflection, by the way, I find that difficult to believe. I mean, presumably, the Russians by now have a fairly good idea of the air defence system in Poland. They are familiar with all Western air defence systems because they've encountered them during the conflict in Ukraine. They will know how many Patriot missile systems there are in Poland and where they're located. They will have a fair idea by now of the capabilities of Western air-to-air missile systems, just to say. Why would they need to test the quality of Poland's air defences? Surely the only effect of sending 19 unarmed drones onto Polish territory would not be to teach the Russians, to give information to the Russians that they don't actually have. It would only be to highlight to the West how inadequate their air defence system is, which, given the current paranoia that we have, is more likely than not to lead to a concentration of more air defence assets in Poland, something which is actually happening. And I don't understand why that would benefit the Russians. Just saying. But anyway, put that all aside. There are lots of theories. I can't prove or refute any one of them. Surely the way forward is for the Poles and the Russians to meet, to talk this through, for the Poles to give examples of these drones. I've heard one claim, for example, which I cannot confirm, that the engines on these drones have been adapted to increase their range with additional fuel cells. But why in that case would the Russians be making such a big play of the fact that the drones have a range of only 700 kilometers? If the Russians added fuel cells to the drones in order to have them travel further distances, why would they draw attention to that very fact by pointing out that the original range of the drones is only 700 kilometers? It makes absolutely no sense. Anyway, let's have meetings, discussions. Let's get the technical experts from the two sides together to go over all of this and to work out exactly what happened and to find out how this incident took place and what it means and what can be done to prevent an incident like this happening again. Well, as Ulyanov said, it doesn't seem as if the Poles are very keen on doing anything to clarify this issue. And, well, to understand why, you have to go to an article in Reuters, because the article in Reuters says that European governments have been shocked and dismayed by the muted reaction to this event from the United States. The fact that the President of the United States has basically said that the whole incident might have been a mistake, an obvious possibility, rather than an intentional incursion, as the narrative that's abroad in Europe insists. Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State, by the way, has lent support to the president's claims. He said that the United States needs an awful lot more information about this whole incident to come to a conclusion about what really happened and whether there was anything intentional about it at all. I would add that the newly elected president of Poland, Mr. Nawrocki, also seems to have his doubts. But anyway, the Europeans clearly were hoping that this incident would result in thunderous denunciations of the Russians from the United States, further strong statements of commitment from the United States to protect Poland. There's been comments about the fact that it was the Netherlands that sent aircraft to Poland's assistance, not the United States. The Americans have pointed out that at this particular time, as a result of a system of rotation, it was the Netherlands' turn to act in that way. But nonetheless, it remains the case that when there is a crisis of this kind, if there were actual genuine incursions, then you would expect the United States to rush to the rescue. That's been the pattern of this throughout not just the current period of crisis, but earlier times of crisis as well. And obviously that didn't happen. And there is dismay across Europe about this. Dismay because the United States did not respond angrily and aggressively to an incursion into Poland of 19 unarmed decoy drones. Again, I can't help but think that this tends to bear out Ulyanov's comment that this looks either a provocation or a misunderstanding, but it leans more towards a provocation, I have to say this, than a misunderstanding, given the dismay in Europe that the United States has responded in this measured and calm and sensible way to this whole incident. Well, the Europeans are probably even more dismayed and angry by a letter that President Trump has circulated amongst them and which he has now published on Truth Social. And I will read the letter. This is, as I said, from President Trump, and I'm taking this from his own Truth Social account. This is what the letter says. I'm ready to do major sanctions on Russia when all NATO nations have agreed and started to do the same thing, and when all NATO nations stop buying oil from Russia. The words stop buying oil from Russia are capitalized. As you know, NATO's commitment to win, capital letters again, capitalized again, the word win is capitalized, has been far less than 100%, and the purchase of Russian oil by some has been shocking. Now, that presumably refers to Hungary and Slovakia, which do buy Russian oil, but it also concerns other European states that continue to buy Russian oil, though they do so through India, which buys crude oil from Russia, refines it, and then exports some of it to Europe. It also, by the way, must cover Turkey, which also buys large quantities of oil from Russia. And of course, Turkey is a NATO member state, and it too, I understand, refines oil and sells oil to other European countries, oil which clearly originates from Russia as well. And Trump continues, it greatly weakens your negotiating position and bargaining power over Russia. Now, for me, the operative word here is your negotiating position. He's not saying NATO's negotiating position or the US's negotiating position with Russia. He's talking about the negotiating position of the European states. Anyway, I am ready to go when you are. Just say when. I believe that this plus NATO as a group, in other words, all NATO member states, Turkey as well, and obviously Hungary and Slovakia too, placing 50 to 100% tariffs on China. The tariffs on China is capitalized. To be fully withdrawn after the war also capitalized with Russia and Ukraine is ended, will also be of great help in ending, and this is also capitalized, this deadly but ridiculous war. The words ridiculous war capitalized too. And then he goes on to say this. He says, China has a strong control and even grip over Russia, and these powerful tariffs will break that grip. Now that is a very interesting statement, by the way, because it also points to one of the objectives, presumably, behind tariffs against Russia and tariffs against other BRICS states, and tariffs against China. It's clearly to break BRICS. Trump, following the meetings in China that took place 10 days ago, published a photo of Putin, Modi and Xi together, and he said that it looks like we, the United States in other words, have lost India and Russia to deep, dark China, whatever it was. And clearly Trump, or at least some of the people who are advising Trump, still imagine that imposing tariffs against China will break the link between China and Russia. Anyway, that's there. That's in the sentence that appears in this letter. But then Trump then goes on to say this. This is not Trump's war. The word Trump's war is capitalized. It would never have started if I was president. It is Biden's and Zelensky's war. Now notice that he doesn't say Putin's war. Biden's and Zelensky's war. So the blame is with Zelensky, but it is not with Putin, apparently. I am only here to help stop it and save thousands of Russian and Ukrainian lives. 7,118 lives lost last week alone. Crazies in capitals. I don't know where he gets the number from, but never mind. If NATO does, as I say, the war will end quickly and all those lives will be saved. If not, you're just wasting my time and the time, energy and money of the United States. Thank you for your attention to this matter, Donald Trump, President of the United States of America. Now, it is this sentence which I suspect is going to raise hackles. If not, you are just wasting my time and the time, energy and money of the United States. What Trump is saying is, look, you want me to impose massive sanctions and tariffs against China, India, other big states and Russia? I'm prepared to do that, absolutely, but you must do it too. You must also stop buying Russian oil, and you must presumably also, he doesn't mention it, stop buying Russian gas as well. In other words, Erdogan must agree to scrap Turk Stream, the entire energy connection with Russia, which he has worked so hard to build up for so long, and which is so important to Turkey's economy and Turkey's economic future, and by the way, to Erdogan's position as well, personal position as well. You must give up all of that. you must join me in all of these sanctions. If we do all of this together, well, yes, it will succeed. The Chinese have all of this power over the Russians. But if you do that, that power will break, will split up BRICS, will be able to divide and conquer and rule again. And of course, the Russians will be forced to come to terms in the way that we wish. But if you don't do that, you're just wasting my time, and I'm going to walk away. And this war isn't my making. It's yours, it's Biden's, it's Zelensky's as well. You're just wasting my time by not doing all of these extraordinary things that I'm asking you to do. Now, it is generally acknowledged, and the Wall Street Journal has already said, that the European governments have already told Donald Trump that they cannot do these things. They cannot impose 100% tariffs on China and India and other BRICS countries. Doing so would devastate their economies. They cannot, for the time being, give up buying oil from India, refined oil from India, which might have an ultimate Russian provenance. Turkey, as I said, if it were to agree to this, and bear in mind this is a letter addressed to NATO countries, it is not addressed to the European Union. So Trump is insisting that Turkey also come on board here. If Turkey does this, then the whole relationship between Turkey and Russia will collapse. The Turkish economy, which is already under severe stress, will go into a tailspin. President Erdogan's position will be undermined. It's all but impossible to imagine that Turkey will do this thing. And of course, Hungary and Slovakia, Fico and Orban, who must, by the way, be quietly furious by this letter. Orban has gone out of his way to position himself as Donald Trump's friend. He made it very clear before the presidential election that he hoped and expected that Donald Trump would win the election. He saw in Donald Trump an ally and friend who would help to return sanity, as Orban would say, to Europe, and who would lead the process towards a negotiated resolution of the conflict in Ukraine in a way that would not do further damage to the Hungarian economy. Anyway, Orban must be furious by this letter, because even though he undoubtedly sees this as what it is, part of a poker game between Trump and the Europeans, a game in which Trump is essentially calling the Europeans bluff. What Trump is threatening to do is something that will crash the Hungarian economy. Hungary, as was explained to Alex Christoforou and myself when we visited Hungary last year and met with senior Hungarian officials, what we learned then was Hungary's heavy dependence on energy flows from Russia, oil and gas from Russia. But what we also learned is the heavy commitment, the heavy investment in the Hungarian economy by China, the setting up of car factories there, and the vital importance that the Hungarians have, the Orban government has, in believing that these factories, these investments from China, are the foundation stone for Hungary's future development and indeed its economic future overall. But anyway, put that aside, it's all but inconceivable that the Europeans will submit to this. And an indication that European governments are not going to submit to this is the fact that I noticed yesterday that the British media, the European media, has buried this story. There's been minimal coverage of this extraordinary letter to NATO governments by Donald Trump. Once, one would have expected that a letter of this kind to NATO states from the President of the United States would have attracted maximum coverage across Europe. There would be anxious commentaries and discussions about this, discussions about how the President's demands could be accommodated. This time, across Europe, there is a deafening silence. The Europeans are complaining about the deafening silence from the United States over the drone incursion. The Americans, Trump, his team, have perhaps equal cause to complain about the deafening silence from Europe in response to this letter from Trump. Now, many are interpreting this letter as an ultimatum from Trump to the Europeans, that he's basically telling them that if you don't do these extraordinary things that I'm asking you to do, these unbearable things that I'm asking you to do, then don't waste my time anymore demanding sanctions. I'm going to finally walk away. You are just wasting my time and the time, energy, and money of the United States. And by the way, the letter, if read carefully, appears to go beyond the question of sanctions, because Trump is linking the letter to NATO's commitment to win in Ukraine. As you know, NATO's commitment to win has been far less than 100%. And you could argue, the case could be made, that what Trump is saying in his own inimitable style is that if you really aren't going to do all of these things, it means that you don't really care so much about winning in Ukraine. So why expect me to do so also? Why are you asking me? Why are you continuing to ask the United States to pull your coals out of the fire when you aren't prepared to put your hands in the fire and to pull the coals out of the fire also? If you don't care that much about winning in Ukraine, why expect me and the United States to do so as well? Now, it is problematic, to put it mildly, to pass too closely comments and letters from Donald Trump. His language is very loose and it is very vivid, and where it's worth the exercise to pass carefully Putin's words, perhaps one shouldn't devote too much time to passing Trump's. But nonetheless, given the way in which this letter is written, and given the fact that this was a letter, and one must assume that before Trump sent it, it will have been checked and looked over by other key figures within the administration, people like Marco Rubio, Pete Hegseth, J.D. Vance, and the others. Well, given that this is a letter, perhaps one should take this letter just a little more seriously. And if so, this is the clearest announcement from Trump we have had up to now, that he's not only on the brink of giving up any idea of sanctions, further sanctions, but that he is also closer than he has ever been to finally doing that which I think he should have done from the outset, which is walk away. Basically, what Trump is saying here is, you're not prepared to do these things. It means that you're not really prepared to do what it takes in order for you to win. So don't expect me to do anything much, anything further either. I'm not prepared to waste time and money and energy on sanctions and such things, and I'm not prepared to waste time, money and energy in trying to achieve a victory over the Russians in Ukraine, which you are not prepared to invest all that you have in order to achieve either. Well, anyway, we will see what happens. I mean, Trump says one thing one day, he says something completely contrary the next. It is an interesting letter, but it is also, and I have to say this, a gamble, because of course we're now having discussions underway between the United States and Europe, and I myself always say that with people like Ursula von der Leyen and Kaja Kallas and Friedrich Merz and Macron and Starmer in charge, assuming that the Europeans will balk at committing further economic suicide in order to satisfy the Americans. And, assuming that might be a mistake. Perhaps over the next couple of days, they will indeed do all of these things. There was a meeting, I believe, of G7 finance ministers, and it seems that nothing of this nature came out of it. We will, however, have a G7 meeting before long. Perhaps something more will come out of that. Though notice that Trump is not addressing only the G7 states. He is addressing all the NATO states, including Turkey, as I said, as well. And, we'll see what comes. But as I said, he's to some extent taking a risk that even as he is calling the Europeans bluff, they won't call his bluff by agreeing to all of the extraordinary things that he is demanding. If they do, of course, it will not change the direction of events in Ukraine, but it will trigger a deeper economic crisis in the West, and not just in Europe, by the way, but in the United States as well. Anyway, a very, very interesting letter from Donald Trump, written, as I said, in his usual inimitable style. Now, what then is actually happening on the main battlefronts? And I say this because ultimately, as Trump does highlight in the letter, we are talking about a war. Well, yesterday there were all kinds of alarms across Eastern Europe about incursions by Russian fighter jets. There were supposedly warnings in Poland, in Romania as well, right across the border. And, partly that might have been connected with the fighting in Ukraine. But mostly, I suspect, it's connected with the Zapad 2025 military exercise, which is taking place in Belarus, and I believe also, by the way, in parts of Western Russia. Now, by the way, can I just take this opportunity to thank the person who corrected my pronunciation of Zapad? The stress is on the first syllable. Now, this is a big exercise. It is not a massive exercise, but over the course of it, in Kaliningrad, for example, the Russians demonstrated Iskander missiles, and there is a film appears which shows a missile launcher with an Iskander missile on a motorway somewhere. I presume it is in Kaliningrad, and the missile appears to be ready for launch, but there's no word or report of any such missile having in fact been launched. So yes, the exercise continues to take place. The Iskander missiles most definitely are there in Kaliningrad. The Russian and Belarusian militaries continue to conduct their exercises. The Poles have closed all the border crossings with Belarus, presumably whilst the exercises are underway. And, of course, the Oreshnik missile that the Russians say that they're going to deploy to Belarus, well, for all I know, it is already located there. So, yes, there is a very tense situation in Europe at the moment, but we need to retain our sense of proportion. Poland is refusing has refused to sever diplomatic relations with Russia, as some people urged it to do. The Americans have responded calmly to the drone situation, and, well, we are at a time of heightened tension in Europe, but I still believe that we are well short of an all-out war between NATO and the Russians, which, given the fact that nuclear weapons would undoubtedly end up being used in such a war, is, as far as I'm concerned, entirely a good thing. Meanwhile, the war in Ukraine continues. The Russians obviously have registered Donald Trump's comments about the United States' willingness to impose these massive sanctions and tariffs on the Russians and the other BRIC states, but only on condition that the Europeans do so. But my sense is that they're not particularly concerned about these threats from Donald Trump. They are aware that US officials are currently meeting with Chinese officials, and that there is going to be a meeting between Scott Bessent and the Chinese chief negotiator on trade issues, and that the Trump administration appears to be trying to get a summit meeting between Trump himself and Xi Jinping organized. The Russians have also confirmed that they are working together with the Chinese to set up alternatives to Euroclear and to establish further alternatives to the finance and trade systems. There is talk that the one sanctions that the G7 might indeed be working towards are sanctions on any banks, any international banks that link up with the Russian interbank payment system. I have already discussed this in my previous program, but already we can see that the Chinese and the Russians, and before long the Russians and the Indians and the Russians and the Turks and all of these countries are going to be working on setting up workarounds for that too. I would add that in a few years' time, as digital currencies become increasingly common, what we're almost certainly going to see is situations where these interbank messaging systems like SWIFT and the Russian, Iranian and Chinese, and by the way, Japanese and Indian ones, become effectively redundant. That world is coming, and the BRIC states are working hard on making it happen. Anyway, the Europeans, the Americans, are thinking of widening banking sanctions in that kind of way. Donald Trump has been talking about imposing further sanctions on Russian banks. It's important to say that these are not going to be sanctions on Russian banks. They are going to be sanctions on banks in third countries, in China, India, other places, Brazil maybe. An incredibly foolish idea, sanctioning banks in one country because of things that are being done by another country, is not going to make America or the European Union any friends. It is going to accelerate the embrace of the alternative financial systems and trading systems that the BRIC states are busy setting up. We've now had that emergency meeting of the BRICS. If people in Europe, in the United States, want to assist BRICS in building its alternative bank and payment and trade systems, and do so as quickly as possible and attract more and more countries into joining those systems, well, they're going about it in exactly the right way. And maybe in some respects, this is the biggest story in the global news world at the moment, the biggest of all the various geopolitical developments. Instead of slowing that process down, the Western states, by their actions, are on the contrary speeding it up, something they have been continuously doing ever since the start of the special military operation, with their reckless decision to freeze the assets of the Russian central bank. Anyway, put all that aside. The war continues. The Russians, as I said, are mostly now focused on the war itself. They said that negotiations between them and the Ukrainians and between them and the Americans are currently at a standstill, and the war goes on and the Russians continue to advance. Now, let me now do my usual brief rundown about the situation in the war. And the Russians this morning have said that the Ukrainians are abandoning Kupiansk. And there's a report about this in TASS, and the TASS report reads, the armed forces of Ukraine have practically withdrawn from the city of Kupiansk, with only small groups staying in well-fortified positions in the city, said Vitaly Ganchev, head of the Kharkov Military Civil Administration. Our forward assault teams have already been in the city. We all saw this footage. They were practically in the heart of Kupiansk. It shows that Ukrainian armed forces have practically left the city. They are staying only in their well-fortified areas and are actively withdrawing from their frontline positions. They realize that staying in Kupiansk will be a death sentence for them. And, well, this is consistent both with the video footage that the Russians themselves have released and with some of the reports that have been trickling out about how the supply routes into Kupiansk have essentially been cut, that the Russians, the footage which has shown the Russians in central Kupiansk, the latest stories about the pipe that the Russians apparently used to infiltrate troops deep into Kupiansk itself, so that they suddenly appeared behind the Ukrainian front lines. Anyway, all of these reports taken together, they seem to suggest that the Battle of Kupiansk is about to end, and that within the next few hours or days, Kupiansk will be under complete Russian control. Now, that is the accumulation of the reports we're getting from various sources, Russian and otherwise. It also is what is being claimed on various Ukrainian Telegram channels. Now, I would say that the official statements from the Ukrainian authorities give a completely different picture of what is going on in Kupiansk. So the civil governor of Kupiansk, maybe the mayor, a Ukrainian official anyway, who is connected to Kupiansk, he said that it is completely untrue. There is no truth to the claims that there are Russian troops in Kupiansk. This story has no reality. And that's what he said. It's been noted by a number of people that the exact location from which he made that claim is difficult to verify, and there's speculation that he was not in Kupiansk when he said it, but that is what he said. The Ukrainian military are apparently claiming that the situation is completely under control. I remember that General Syrski said exactly the same a few months ago, back in March, when the Russians were in the process of storming Suja in Kursk region, that the situation was completely under control. The Ukrainians had the situation entirely in hand. There was no reason or cause for concern. And President Zelensky himself has also been talking. He says that it's an absolute lie that the Russians are making advances in eastern Ukraine. There is no evidence, there's no truth to these claims of Russian advances. All such claims are mere Russian disinformation. One shouldn't believe them. The Ukrainians presumably are holding on successfully to all of their positions. So that is what the Ukrainians are saying. Now, you can believe that if you wish. I myself am not in Kupiansk. As I've said already, I have no direct access to information from either the Russian or the Ukrainian militaries. It seems to me that the evidence on the contrary suggests that what the Russians are saying and what is supported by some Ukrainian channels is far more likely to be true. But I am giving what I hope is comprehensive coverage here. If you prefer to believe the Ukrainian accounts that there are no Russian troops in Kupiansk at all, that all that we've been hearing about Russian advances in Kupiansk is untrue, well, that's up to you. In that case, as I often say, I have a bridge to sell you, but that's up to you. You can believe that. So it does look as if, at least as far as I'm concerned, it looks as if Kupiansk is indeed about to fall. If we believe Ganchev, and I'm not sure why Ganchev should not be telling the truth here, Kupiansk might even fall within the next few hours. Now, Deep State, the Ukrainian mapping project, which has clearly been under some pressure from the Ukrainian authorities, nonetheless provided a map update of the situation in Siversk, and it showed a huge belt, well, I say huge, a big belt of territory, a large belt of territory, several square kilometers of territory, immediately to the north of Siversk, in the grey zone. And this included this agricultural complex north of Siversk, where there have been reports that the Russians have already established themselves. And interestingly, this entire territory seems to be linked to Russian forces that have been advancing towards Siversk from the east. It doesn't look so far that this belt of territory concerns the Russian forces who've captured the village of Serebyanka and cleared the Serebyanka forest. They do not so far seem to have made significant advances towards Siversk from the north across the Seversky Donetsk River. Though, if this territory that Deep State suggests is in the grey zone, is actually under Russian control, as I strongly suspect, the Deep State often colours territory that the Russians control or have just captured as being in the grey zone, in other words, still contested, even after the Russians have effectively consolidated control of it. If the Russians do actually control this territory, then, of course, the Russians will have little difficulty advancing south from the Serebyanka forest and from Serebyanka itself and crossing the Seversky Donetsk River and establishing a powerful position immediately north of Siversk. Anyway, this is the first clear admission from a semi-official Ukrainian source that the situation in Siversk is now critical. If the Russians have a presence in this belt of territory that Deep State says they have now established a presence in, if they control this territory or are soon in complete control of this territory, then it seems to me that the future of Ukrainian control of Siversk can be counted in days, perhaps even hours. Now, the Russians have published a lot of footage of Siversk. They're not actually shown any Russian troops fighting inside the residential areas, the central residential areas of Siversk up to now. But they are publishing footage of what appears to be relentless shelling and bombing of Siversk by the Russian military. The town is devastated. I couldn't see a single building in the footage that I have seen that appears to have been left intact and standing. Of course, I haven't seen the entire town, though this is a comparatively small place, around 10,000 people before the war. But anyway, it reminds me very much of footage that I saw of Avdiivka before its fall, and even as the Russians are about to capture Kupiansk, it looks as if they're about to capture Siversk as well. I'm guessing that the sequence will be first Kupiansk, then Siversk, then probably Liman, after that perhaps Pakrovsk, which is of course a much bigger place than Kupiansk, Siversk or Liman are. But anyway, it is starting to look as if these towns are starting to fall. And, well, let's now turn to the situation in Pakrovsk. We've had another 24 hours without any video footage to speak of from the area to the northeast of Pakrovsk. There have been no changes to the maps that the various mapping projects published. There's been continued claims from the Ukrainians that they're conducting counterattacks in this area to the northeast of Pakrovsk. But all I can say is that for the moment, at least, it does look to me as if those claims that Radovka made several days ago, that the Ukrainian counterattacks in Kupiansk, in northeast Pakrovsk, have been unsuccessful. It's increasingly looking to me as if those claims are true. So there it is. The Ukrainians so far have not succeeded in rolling back the area of the Russian breakthrough in August. They've deployed many of their best brigades to this area. They've deployed many of their best drone operators to this area as well. The Russians have been taking advantage of this by bombing and shelling the Ukrainian troops heavily in precisely this area. And the Ukrainians are said to be suffering very, very heavy losses. But the Ukrainian objective of breaking this Russian breakthrough, of rolling the Russians back, that has not so far been achieved, and it is looking increasingly unlikely that it will be. Now, Radovka doesn't publish updates over the weekend, so I don't know what is going on within Pakrovsk itself. Video footage continues to show Russian advances north of Udachne in the southwestern areas of Pakrovsk. Radovka, however, claims that western Pakrovsk is now effectively under Russian control. There's still obviously a lot of fighting still to take place, but my overall sense is that the Battle of Pakrovsk is, well, continuing on its now well-established trajectory, with the Russians holding on to their major gains in August and enlarging their control of the town itself. And, well, the Russians have also apparently continued their push towards Konstantinovka, the bigger town immediately to the east of Pakrovsk, and they're claiming that they've now captured positions south of Yunakovka, the fortified village in Sumy region, which the Ukrainians have been up to now successfully defending. There have been many reports that Yunakovka has come entirely under Russian control, but the Russian Defense Ministry has still not confirmed this. But Russian officials are speaking of Russian advances south of Yunakovka, which may suggest that Yunakovka is indeed under Russian control, and that the Russians are intending to reactivate their offensive in Sumy region, which would certainly ring alarm bells in Kiev if it happened. And in the meantime, the Russian advance in Zaporozhye continues remorselessly. We've now had video footage that confirms the presence of Russian troops south of the city of Zaporozhye itself, in the central area of the fortified town of Stepnogorsk. That brings the Russians significantly closer to Zaporozhye from the south. I don't think the Russians intend to try to storm Zaporozhye from the south, but if they capture Stepnogorsk, even as they advance westwards from the east, and there are more reports, in fact there are reports every day of the Russian forces that are advancing towards the river, towards the Dnieper, from the east, continuing to make more and more progress as I said, the important village of Veliko Mikhailovka looks likely to be stormed fairly soon. Anyway, it's becoming increasingly clear that some kind of pincer movement around the towns of Guliapolye and Orechov is forming. The supply roads that provide supplies to the Ukrainian garrisons in these two towns are at risk of being cut off. All the major fortifications that the Ukrainians created are located to the south of these towns. The Ukrainians have not created fortifications to anything like the same extent to repel attacks from the north or the east or the west. And of course, if Guliapolye and Orechov are indeed captured by the Russians, then the only major urban center that is left under Ukrainian control in Zaporozhye region would be the city of Zaporozhye itself. And though this would be by far the biggest city that the Russians would have attempted to assault, if they ever do try to do that over the course of this war, it is nonetheless a city which the Russians claim as their own. And for the record, I think it might actually be, for various reasons I don't intend to discuss in this program, actually rather difficult in that situation where it is essentially under siege. It might be difficult for the Ukrainians to defend. So we are edging every day closer and closer to the point of crisis. The situation in Donbass for the Ukrainians is not just weakening, but weakening faster and faster. And the situation in Zaporozhye region is weakening faster as well. And to repeat again, if Ukraine were to lose Donbass in its entirety, if the Russians were to capture the city of Zaporozhye itself and to arrive at the river, if they were to cross, by the way, the river in this area and advance westwards towards cities like Kryvyi Rog and Nikopol and others, well, Ukraine's very existence as a state would then indeed be in jeopardy. And again, to repeat a point I've made many times, we are probably closer to that point than many people in the West yet realize. So that is the situation in the war. We could start to receive important news of cities falling, or at least towns falling, like Kupiansk and Siversk, fairly soon. And then, as I said, Liman would presumably fairly quickly follow. And then perhaps towards the end of the year, we will start to see Pokrovsk itself, the battle for Pokrovsk, end. And then at that point, especially if the Russians continue their advance in Zaporozhye region, it will already be impossible to deny that there is a military crisis in Ukraine. As for the President of the United States, as for Donald Trump, I get the sense that he is indeed now finally at that point where, having exhausted all possibilities, as he would say, he is indeed about to wash his hands of the affair. I don't think he's exactly walking away, but it doesn't seem to me as if he really wants to invest more time and energy and money in this war. Not because he wants to do something that would please the Russians. Quite the contrary. But because I think he's starting to get advice that the war is already lost. Now I'm going to touch on something which I have referenced before, and that is that, to my knowledge, there is a review underway of the real state of Ukrainian losses in this conflict, which is taking place in the United States, mostly in the United States and in Britain. I have been provided with information about this, and all I will say about it, and I get to be very careful because, as I said, this concerns information which is at the very least confidential, and which I personally believe is almost certainly either classified or likely to become classified very soon. Anyway, the figures for Ukrainian losses are going to upgrade the level of Ukrainian losses by orders of magnitude above those which have previously been reported by Western governments, the American and British governments, and by other agencies of the West. I noticed, by the way, that in the Daily Telegraph there's been a plaintive claim that as a result of the actions being taken by the new heads of the intelligence agencies in Washington, the best people are being pushed out of the analytic centers that within the CIA and other places that cover Ukraine. And of course this specifically relates to Russiagate, but I would point out that we're talking about the same people who presumably gave the advice that if the Russian assets were frozen, the Russian economy would collapse, the same people who doubted the resilience and competence of the Russian military, the same people who expected that the operation, the offensive that the Ukrainians conducted in the summer of 2023 might have some prospect of success. Though, in fairness, I understand that the CIA was more skeptical about that offensive. It was people in the US military who were mostly keen on it. You can read this article. Actually, it's an interesting article in itself. Trump's vengeance against CIA is blinding US to threat of Putin. Purge of intelligence officials means remaining agents are likely to water down reports on Russia, warn former officers. All I would say about that is that Russiagate itself, which is the major topic discussed in this article, where these intelligence officers supposedly distinguish themselves, was by any estimation a ghastly, awful debacle, even if it wasn't something far worse than that, which of course it was. In other words, even if it wasn't a serious attempt to interfere in the elections in the United States. And since then, these exceptional intelligence officers that this article is defending have got things wrong about Russia again and again. I mean, there may be some talented and objective officers, intelligence officers involved here, officials here, I'm not saying, but there is no recognition in this article that there has been a consistent pattern of Western intelligence getting Russia over the last three and a half years. Well, you can take it longer than that, 10 years, profoundly and completely wrong. Anyway, never mind. I suspect that, as I said, there is a major rethink going on that involves a re-examination of casualty rates in the war. And I suspect that that too is going to change attitudes, at least in the United States, when the information that I am aware of finally filters through. Anyway, there we are. We're approaching the crisis in the war. Trump himself seems to, at some level at least, understand that. You can't rely on him, though. The Europeans, of course, have not changed their views, but there it is. This is where I finish today's program. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop. Links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.